Excellent. Okay. So yeah, thanks once again, Anna. My name's Quentin Crombie. I'm the Director of Policy at Roads Australia. And today, if I can get my slides to scroll, there we go. What we're going to do is give you a bit of an overview of the policy team and talk about how we've identified the policy priorities for the 12 months ahead, and give you a bit of a snapshot as to what those policy activities are. And that will probably stimulate your interest in some of the projects that we're going to take on, and we'll discuss ways in which you might be able to be involved, including through the working groups. So this is the organisational chart for Roads Australia. We're not a huge team, we're quite a small organisation, and in fact the policy team is very small indeed. There's just 3 of us, and in fact one of the newest team members, which is Emily Klein, she is the Senior Policy Analyst, and she's actually only part-time. So overall we're actually only 2.7, so quite a small team. And I'm also new to the organisation, having joined in November last year, and in fact only started full-time in January. So very briefly, my background is actually in motorsport safety, and most recently I was running a research and development company in Switzerland, and before that a policy and research organisation in Paris. So when I was recruited to the role, I wasn't necessarily recruited for my policy experience, probably more so for my leadership, strategy and planning skills. So as I said, a small team and relatively new as well. So in terms of policy priorities, where did we actually start? So when I started at the organisation earlier this year, we already had a strategic plan in place, which was a rolling 3-year plan. And in that plan, there were 5 key policy areas, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with those. They were safety, capacity, journey reliability, transport reform and sustainability. However, one of the things I noticed when I arrived was that we'd identified a lot of actions that we were trying to deliver, and in fact, too many, given the size of the team and the capability of the organisation. So we realised that one of the things we needed to do in the next period was really try and pare that back and become a lot more focused around probably just 1 or 2 areas within each of those streams. So what we started with was a framework, and this framework really was in place to try and really tighten up what those priorities are and match them to our mission and objectives. There was a degree of misalignment between what we'd identified and what Roads Australia's mission was and what their strategic objectives were. So one of the first things we did was look for ways to really tighten that up, and equally make sure that our internal capabilities were aligned as well. So it's all very well to identify strategic priorities and policy priorities, but if you don't have the internal capabilities to deliver those, then you're not going to get very far. So we went through a very extensive exercise at the start of this year. We did a SWOT and a PESTEL analysis, and that a lot of those inputs were involved interviews and surveys with our members and other key stakeholders, and it was quite an exhaustive and extensive process that we went through. So we were looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of the organisation, as well as the opportunities and threats. We also, as part of that process of actually engaging with external stakeholders, we actually worked very closely with the road and transport agencies, and earlier in the year we spent a day with those agencies to hear about what their priorities were, to make sure that our priorities were aligned. We also spent, following that session with the road and transport agencies, we also had a day with the board to actually work through we reviewed what our mission was and what our organisational objectives were, and then we really tried to hone down into the detail and work out what our policy priorities would be for the year ahead. More recently, we've obviously had to make a number of adjustments in relation to COVID-19, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So in terms of that engagement with the road and transport agencies, some of the key points from that was that we were actually already very well aligned with what we had identified as our priorities. There was, however, an emphasis from the road agencies on safety and sustainability, and in particular resilience, given the terrible bushfires that had occurred in Victoria and New South Wales. So we made some adjustments to our priorities to really pick up and emphasise those three areas. There was also a lot of discussion around data-driven decision-making. So there was a realisation that more and more we need access to good data sets in order to help drive decision-making and in order to benchmark where we are now, so we can track performance over time. So that was a theme that came through virtually from every agency head. So I just need to shift this around for a moment. So I'm sure you're aware of what our mission is, but nevertheless, we took the time to actually reflect. And as you know, we describe ourselves as the peak body for roads within an integrated transport system. So that is something that has been, well, around for some time, but there is now a greater emphasis on roads within an integrated transport system. So it's not just about roads. In terms of the strategic objective for the 12 months ahead, the board really wanted to establish roads as a leader and be a voice of influence. So one of the key ways that we can do that is through our policy agenda. So we want to be the organisation that governments reference when they want to take decisions about policy. They want to know what issue in any of those policy areas that we're focusing on. So we absolutely want to be a voice of influence and a leader in this policy space. So we went through that process, reflected, we realised that our 5 policy streams were in fact the right streams to be focused on. However, there was a greater emphasis on safety and capacity, and there was also the realisation that we needed to widen sustainability to also include resilience. And that's particularly so given this double shock of the bushfires and COVID-19. So in terms of developing the policy plan, I'm actually probably going to skip over this because I'm mindful that we're on a fairly tight agenda today. But very, very briefly, what we've done with each of the actions that we've identified is we've started with the end in mind. So we've identified what the objective is, and we've worked backwards to work out what those outputs, what the deliverables should be, and therefore what resources we need to deliver against those. So the inputs. In terms of the current COVID-19 crisis, we've had to make quite a few adjustments to our policy plan. So there were quite a few events that we had scheduled as face-to-face events. We've had to push quite a few of those back, but some of the more important ones, which were impacted directly by COVID-19, we've decided to switch some of those events to online using the webinar platform. And we've also actually come up with a whole series of other topical events that we're also running on webinars. For example, last week we did an event on transport network pricing and how COVID-19 may impact that. This week we did an event on resilience and sustainability and how COVID-19 is impacting those agendas. So I'm going to dive straight into the individual streams and just give you a quick snapshot of what we're going to be focusing on in the 12 months ahead. So in the safety stream, I guess our flagship event was going to be our Spotlight on Safety Forum, which we had intended to deliver in June, but we've decided that that's not going to be possible. So we've pushed that out to October. And that will be a great forum and platform for all the agency heads to come together, share their experience and best practice on safety, and engage with industry and academia as well. One of the other major deficiencies in this area was the lack of data on road crash data, fatalities, injuries, and there was a realisation that there needs to be more effort on standardising and enhancing that data. So we're actually going to devote quite a lot of effort early in the next financial year to working with the National Office for Road Safety and other stakeholders to help try and address that issue. We've also got a road worker safety working group, and they are very, or have been very active on working on ways in which the procurement process can be adjusted to increase focus on safety matters, particularly in relation to road workers. Moving on to capacity. Our main focus here is on procurement reform, and back in March, we did a major workshop with industry and government where we were trying to identify strategies to address the myriad of issues that are currently being experienced with procurement. So we're in the final stages of preparing a report for the Victorian government, which hopefully will be applicable to other governments as well, but we're in the final stages of preparing that report, and we'll be working directly with the Victorian government to help implement some of those reforms. So just a brief snapshot of where the key issue areas were: visibility of the pipeline, capability and capacity, risk, the legal frameworks, and culture and inclusion as well. So as I said, that's really the flagship initiative there. Obviously, we're doing some other activities as well in and around trying to get better skills data from our members, so that we can help manage the skills shortage lists that are managed by government. Transport reform. We have a transport reform symposium that we were going to do in August face-to-face, now pushing that out to September. Hopefully we will be able to run it face-to-face by September. And the focus of that symposium will be the use of hydrogen, and we'll also have a separate session dedicated to road reform. And that actually picks up on a very important piece of work that Infrastructure Victoria have done and presented last week. Some of you may have been at that webinar. Just quickly scanning down the list, we also had a study visit planned in September. Clearly that won't be possible this year, so we've bumped that out to March next year. The other thing here that's worth mentioning is some work that we're going to do in and around mobility as a service. We've realised that that's probably an area that is very topical right now, and some of the road agencies, or a number of the road agencies, emphasise this as an area of key focus for them. Journey reliability stream. I think the key flagship initiative here is the social licence work that we are wanting to do here, where we're going to engage with the community and try and develop a better understanding about what their expectations are, what their fears are, what they see as the key risks around a number of transport areas, things like road reform, sustainability, but that's probably going to be our flagship program here under journey reliability. Moving on to the final stream, sustainability. We've decided to actually form an alliance with ISCA, so the Sustainability Council, the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, and we are going to, again, I guess to emphasise what the flagship initiative here, we're going to work on developing a paper which aggregates all of the best practice initiatives that are going on around the globe, with an emphasis and focus on what's happening here in Australia, with some overarching commentary about what industry should focus on in the 3 to 5 years ahead. So moving on to the implementation of the plan, I guess the key points here are that this is obviously something that will be implemented under the control of the policy committee and the board, and we will be using various working groups under each of those streams to help develop content for each of the projects. And I guess that is where there is the greatest opportunity for you to be involved. As Anna was mentioning before, we have just updated our terms of reference for those working groups where we're actually having 2 spots, one for a fellow and one for a young professional, so that any working group that's formed, there'll always be an ex officio position for a fellow and for a young professional. So it's a great way for those that are on the call today, that's a great way for you to be involved. We'll also be, as I said, we're running a series of webinars at the moment and other events where we're looking for keynote speakers and panelists. So again, you know, that'll be a great way for you to be involved if you happen to be a particular subject matter expert, perhaps on mobility as a service. Great way for you to be involved, being a panelist or even a speaker at one of our events. So the other key area, of course, is the project that you're working on, and I'm still coming up to speed with this, but Anna was obviously speaking about that a few moments ago, and I understand that the project for this year will be mental health. Now, although I did move through those other slides quite quickly, you probably noticed that there wasn't anything specific there on mental health, which isn't to say it's not an important issue. It's just that for the period ahead, we haven't identified that as I guess, a priority area, but of course that might change. And some of the work that you might do this year may result in us doing a lot more work in that area. I guess the issue of mental health is relevant to both safety and to capacity as well. And ultimately, it's going to be about developing a stronger culture within the industry. And I think that is clearly something that's particularly important and deficient at the moment. That was something that really came out of that procurement reform workshop, was issues with culture. And one of my favourite expressions from Peter Drucker is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So the point here is that unless you have a strong culture, a really robust culture, then you're unlikely to be successful. So as I said, this isn't something necessarily that we will put a lot of resources into this year, but the work that you do may well lead into some more, us being much more active in this space in the next period. So happy to take questions. And happy to flick back to some of those other slides with a list of projects if you wanted to take a closer look at those.
So Quentin, do we want to maybe just, well, if you flick back to that one of those slides, just in terms of the working groups and the opportunities for fellows to get involved.
Yeah.
So we intend on issuing, essentially confirming fellows' preferences or interest areas. So everybody will get an opportunity to update, if they haven't already, which policy areas they have a particular interest in or can contribute towards. And then would run an EOI process around what that, around actual, the working group itself.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've talked about is being clear on what the expectation of that working group would be, and including the time element, I suppose, which is one of the contributing factors to people being able to participate or not.
Yes.
Is there anything that you would sort of like to guide the fellows on in terms of what they could think about? Obviously, you've spoken about the opportunities to speak or be a panelist, but is there anything in particular you think that they should be conscious of when considering those opportunities?
Yeah, look, a couple of things to say on that, Anna. I guess the first one is we only have one working group that's active at the moment. So there is quite a lot of work and effort that goes in from our side anyway in terms of running these working groups. So we don't want to have the working groups running just for the sake of having a working group. So the reason why the Road Worker Safety Working Group is active now is that we have quite a lot of specific projects where we need external contributors. So some of those other groups might not be activated until later in the year, until such time as some of these other activities kick off and we need, as I said, external input. In terms of a time commitment, I know that quite a few on the Road Worker Safety Working Group have found it challenging to dedicate the time, because it's not just about turning up to meetings and contributing at the meetings. There are quite a lot of specific actions that come out of those meetings that need quite a lot of time in between. So it's difficult for me to tell you what that time commitment might be, because every working group is going to be different.
Yeah.
But there is certainly an expectation that it's more than just turning up to meetings and giving your opinions.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note, that if people are considering expressing an interest, that they understand that you know, it's a commitment in terms of time and resources.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. Absolutely. But I still think it's really positive that the board agreed that it was important that each working group have a dedicated representative from the fellows cohort and the young professionals cohort as well. So I think that sends a positive message that we value the contribution that you can make.
Absolutely, and I think that's the extraordinary opportunity, is it's showing real commitment from the leadership of Roads Australia and industry more broadly, as well as you know, as well as just continued engagement and ensuring that the future of the industry has a voice at the policy table.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And sorry, one other thing I'll emphasise, Anna, is that we have, in direct response to the COVID-19 crisis, we've tried to come up with a series of policy webinars that are topical and relevant, and we are always looking for content experts. So again, you know, you might get a phone call or an email from one of us asking if you'd like to participate. Again, that's to make a contribution. So although these webinars have been established specifically in response to COVID-19, I think already there seems to be a great appetite for them, and they appear to have been well received. So even post COVID-19, whenever that's going to be, that you know, we may well continue to run a series of webinars. So again, great opportunity for some of you to, you know, to be involved, particularly if you have a deep expertise in a certain area.
Excellent. Does anybody else have any questions among the fellowship themselves? We have, so Brendan has asked, hi Quentin, would you like to outline that it's not just people in policy areas that have a valuable contribution in the policy space? So
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but if you're talking about other specific skill domains in relation to things like strategy and planning, yeah, absolutely. But maybe there's something else that you mean by that. Maybe you could open the mic and.
Done. Yeah, no worries, mate. Look, what it was about is when we're actually on the policy chapters and dealing with the committees, we need, in my experience anyway, it needs a plethora of opinions on there. You know, good policy isn't just developed by a couple of people sitting around together. The more experience that you've got in particularly different areas is really useful to bring to the table. So from that side, if you're not necessarily just in a policy area where you work, that doesn't mean that you're not valuable, and we certainly don't want to hear your opinion.
Yeah, Brendan, I think that's absolutely right. You know, we talk about diversity, gender diversity, and you know, ethnic, you know, different cultures, and all of those sorts of things. But actually, diversity of thought is also extremely important. So I think you get diversity of thought by bringing in other skill domains. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
Great. Well, I don't think we have any other further questions at this point, Quentin, but are you available if there's anything further that we need to touch in with throughout the project development?
Of course, absolutely. I'll probably drop out of this meeting shortly, but if you needed me to come back in later to address anything specific, happy to. Great. Either now or any time, basically. So I would also, again, you know, those, I moved through those slides pretty quickly, and apologies that they weren't particularly, certainly I had limited time to pull this together, basically. So apologies if there wasn't more detail there, but certainly happy to make some of those slides available after the meeting, particularly those lists of activities that we are going to commit to over the next 12 months. Just one thing I will say is that they are in draft at the moment, so they still need to go through a process of approval. And in fact, we have a board meeting coming up on the 14th of May where they should be approved and ratified. But we've gone through a sort of an extensive process with lots of dialogue with the board, so I doubt very much if it would change all that much.